Waters World Easter quiz. But first, researchers believe the coronavirus came from bats. But were Chinese scientists involved? A Waters World investigation next. There's a nasty battle breaking out between the United States and China over the virus. The CIA says China downplayed the virus and is lying about the body count. The Washington Post is reporting that U.S. intelligence does not believe, at this point, that China created the virus as a biological weapon to use against us. But there are different beliefs about how the outbreak happened. Most scientists believe the virus originated in bats. One theory is that the virus jumped from bats to humans at a Chinese wet market in Wuhan, where various animals are sold. Another theory is that the virus spread from a Chinese biolab in Wuhan, where the government collects and studies viruses. Chinese lab workers may have been contaminated while studying infected bats, triggering an outbreak. Either way, we don't know what happened because the Chinese Communist government has banned American scientists from Wuhan and is kicking American journalists out of the country. Now, these suspicious actions are damning and unacceptable. We need answers in order to save American lives. Joining me now, an expert on China and president of the Population Research Institute, Stephen Mosher, author of Bully of Asia. Stephen, do you believe the virus came from the Chinese wet market or from a laboratory?
No, I think the Chinese wet market story is a cover story, and I think the cover story is now blown. And let me tell you why. The story begins in a bat cave about 600 miles away from the city of Wuhan, which we all know now as the center of the Wuhan virus epidemic. In the bat cave, we had a gentleman who works for the Chinese Center for Disease Control, which is in Wuhan, by the way, a gentleman by the name of Tian Junhua, surname first, of course, so that's Mr. Tian. Mr. Tian is known as China's Batman. He's been going into bat caves for the last 15 years and collecting bat urine, bat feces, and the horseshoe bats themselves, thousands of them. And what has he been doing with the urine, feces, and the bats themselves? He's been taking them to two biolabs in the city of Wuhan. One is the Center for Disease Control, which is 280 yards away from the wet market that we're supposed to believe is the source of the epidemic. The other is the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is 7 miles away from the wet market. In those two institutes, you know, Jesse, it's amazing. Over the last 15 years, China has collected 2,000 dangerous viruses from the wild, including 300 coronaviruses, roughly, we understand, many of which came from the intermediate horseshoe bats that we're talking about as the original carrier of the virus. But if those viruses had stayed in bats in caves 600 miles away from Wuhan, they would never come in contact with people.
Yeah, so why are they taking the bats out of the caves, bringing them to research facilities, and investigating the viruses that the bats have? What is the purpose of that kind of virus research?
Well, I think there were a number of purposes. One goes back to the SARS epidemic back in 2003, which killed a lot of people in China, infected a lot more. The SARS virus, by the way, was being studied in a lab in Beijing in 2004 and twice leaked from the lab. In other words, Chinese labs have a history of leaking. This COVID-19 is the second SARS-like virus. So the research was being done to find out more about SARS. But think about this. Over the last 15 years, China has doubled the number of known viruses. Over 200 years, we collected 2,000. Now we have 4,000. Why? Because all these hundreds, thousands of viruses are being kept in these two biolabs in the city of Wuhan. Many of them are dangerous. Now we know this. We know that some of those coronaviruses are capable of directly infecting human lung tissue. Right. Now, does that sound familiar? Does that sound like it can cause pneumonia?
I mean, it really is. You know, because I think, as you told our producers, if this had actually come and originated from the wet market, the Chinese Communist government would have just burned it to the ground. But for some reason, These wet markets, we're hearing reports, are reopened, which doesn't make a lot of sense if that is the prevailing theory for how it originated. All right, I wish we had more time, Stephen. This is fascinating. We're going to have you on back to explain a little bit more about these viruses in China. Thanks very much for your expertise.
Thank you, Jesse.
Coming up, coronavirus cover-up at the World Health Organization. Did someone get paid off? We'll look into that. And later, a Water's World Easter quiz. It's clear to everybody who's been following this that the World Health Organization is in China's pocket. The WHO put out fake news on the coronavirus in January. They said it wasn't contagious, human to human. That cost a lot of lives and a lot of money. Taiwan actually alerted the organization in December that it was contagious, and they just got blown off. The WHO said Trump's travel ban was racist and that masks weren't necessary. They dragged their feet, labeling this thing a pandemic. The organization praised China for handling the virus tremendously well, they said. At the same time, China was lying and covering it up. Totally unacceptable. The United States gives the WHO the bulk of their cash, $400 million a year, and we got nothing for it. The president's not happy.
They missed the call. They could have called it months earlier. They would have known. And they should have known. And they probably did know. So we'll be looking into that very carefully. And we're going to put a hold on money spent to the W.H.O.
The Director General of the WHO, Dr. Tedros from Ethiopia, shot back at our president.
If you don't want many more body bags, then you refrain from politicizing it. My short message is, please quarantine politicizing COVID.
I don't like what's coming out of this guy's mouth. He should be apologizing. He's the political operator. He's a political puppet. China groomed him and picked him to be president of the WHO. He wasn't America's choice. He covered up 3 cholera outbreaks while he was in charge in Ethiopia. But China runs Ethiopia like it's a colony. It's the African nation's top trading partner. Billions in trade and loans. Billions in Chinese infrastructure and investment deals over there. China pretty much owns Ethiopia, and they got what they paid for. The UN has about 15 of these little agencies like the WHO, and China controls 5 of them. It's how China exerts influence and rises on the world stage. It's how the game's played. But when the corruption costs U.S. lives and trillions in wealth, a price has to be paid. No more money until changes are made. Now, Americans are reacting swiftly to these new federal recommendations. Polls show 55% of us are wearing masks or some sort of facial covering now. Here's the First Lady sporting a mask right there. But what's the best one? And what's the real reason we need to wear them?